Most people are still looking at the ceasefire language, the press briefings, the diplomatic choreography. That is the surface. The real movement is happening underneath, where military timing, energy, choke points, and financial pressure are being fused into a single strategic design. On the 30th, a possible turning point began to emerge. Washington was presented with a new option for accelerating pressure on Iran: the potential combat deployment of the United States Army's long-range hypersonic weapon, Dark Eagle. If activated, this would not be another symbolic move. It would mark a shift from signaling to execution. In a report sent to the administration, Admiral Brad Cooper outlined military options that could alter the battlefield in a decisive way. The central argument was brutally simple: speed changes everything. Dark Eagle is being discussed as a tool for striking before Iran can react, before ballistic missile units can disperse, and before hardened military assets can disappear back into protected terrain. That is the logic, not attrition, compression of time. The scenario now being examined involves short, violent, highly focused attacks designed to break the deadlock around the Strait of Hormuz. This is not just a maritime corridor. It is one of the world's critical energy arteries, a narrow passage where regional conflict instantly becomes global economic pressure. At the same time, the objective extends beyond shipping lanes. The broader aim is to weaken the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps inside Iran's internal power structure by hitting the military systems, logistical nodes, and economic channels that sustain its leverage. On the ground and at sea, the United States has already tightened control around ports and maritime access points. The intention is clear: disrupt cargo flows, constrict revenue, and squeeze the financial base that supports Iran's military-industrial machinery. Economic pressure and military positioning are no longer separate tracks. They are being run as one campaign. Iran, for its part, has not responded with passivity. Officials have issued repeated warnings that any escalation will be met rapidly and forcefully. Tehran insists the blockade will fail, and it continues to argue that reopening the Strait of Hormuz is impossible while American forces remain in the area. At the diplomatic level, Iran is still advancing a two-stage proposal. First, all sanctions must be lifted. Only after that, Tehran says, can substantive talks begin on the nuclear program. And that position reveals something important. The confrontation is not cooling. It is hardening behind the language of negotiation. And this is where Dark Eagle enters the picture as more than just another weapons system. Its possible appearance in the Middle East has unsettled Iranian calculations precisely because it threatens the one advantage Tehran has relied on for years: the ability to move, hide, launch, and vanish before retaliation arrives. This would be the weapon's first combat use if approved. That matters. It means the discussion has already moved past theory, beyond procurement slides and demonstration ranges, into the zone of real-world operational planning. Dark Eagle travels at hypersonic speed above Mach 5, with a range of roughly 1,725 miles, or about 2,775 kilometers. But raw speed is only part of the story. Its real value lies in combining that speed with high precision against heavily defended or hardened targets. That matters because Iran has spent years building survivability into its missile force. During periods of reduced tension and temporary ceasefire conditions, facilities believed to be linked to ballistic missile storage and preparation have continued to benefit from concealment, fortification, and terrain protection. Traditional strike windows are narrow. A hypersonic strike collapses them further. Iran's familiar method has been effective for a reason. Mobile launchers emerge from hardened shelters, fire and retreat before conventional counterstrikes can arrive. It is a system built around timing, geography, and disciplined movement. Dark Eagle threatens to erase that rhythm. If the response window shrinks to near zero, then even a well-rehearsed launch cycle becomes a liability. A unit that hesitates for a moment risks losing the entire platform before it can re-enter cover. That is why the weapon is being framed not just as an offensive option, but as a means of altering Iran's operational behavior once the system forces the other side to change how it moves, where it hides, and when it launches. The battlefield has already begun to tilt. If the current standoff escalates again, Dark Eagle could become the first strike choice in any renewed air campaign. The proposal from United States Central Command points in that direction. Use hypersonic reach to hit ballistic missile launchers that sit beyond the practical envelope of existing strike methods. This is especially relevant against mobile systems operating from mountain shelters and tunnel complexes. Iran's launch units do not need to stay exposed for long. They need only enough time to emerge, fire, and disappear. The entire American problem has been compressed into that brief interval. Parallel to this, the blockade campaign has expanded in scale. Destroyers, helicopters, submarines, and more than 200 aircraft are being used to sustain pressure across the maritime and air domain. The message is cumulative. No single move is decisive on its own, but together they create a tightening net. Over the Red Sea, F-18 Super Hornets have continued operating with guided munitions such as the GBU-54, using both GPS and laser guidance. That gives American planners flexibility against moving targets at sea, as well as fixed positions on land. It is a practical example of naval and air power being blended into one continuous pressure system. Admiral Cooper stated that American forces had already blocked 42 commercial ships attempting to break the existing maritime restrictions. Of those, 41 were oil tankers. Together, they were carrying 69 million barrels of crude that Iran was unable to bring to market. The financial effect is not abstract. The estimated lost revenue exceeds $6 billion. That is not a side note. It is the bloodstream of the confrontation. When a blockade begins to deny that level of export capacity, the impact reaches well beyond shipping. It weakens state liquidity, procurement options, patronage networks, and the ability to sustain industrial output tied to defense production. Pressure on the sea becomes pressure inside the state. As for potential targets, Dark Eagle would likely be reserved for hardened, high-value sites that conventional methods struggle to destroy quickly. One area drawing particular attention is a site referred to in the reporting as Yazd, linked by some assessments to sensitive processing activity involving radioactive materials. What makes it strategically relevant is not only the mission set, but the terrain. The area reportedly includes multiple tunnel entrances reinforced inside narrow canyon geography that is ideal for concealment. It is also ideal for the rapid emergence of mobile ballistic missile systems that can launch toward Gulf targets or American bases and then retreat back into protected cover. For years, that pattern has given Iran a credible retaliatory mechanism, but under a hypersonic threat, the margin for survival narrows sharply. Detection, tracking, and strike can begin to merge into one sequence rather than three separate phases. That is why locations like Yazd could rank high in any early Dark Eagle employment scenario, and not only the tunnel mouths themselves. The surrounding support architecture matters too. Logistics depots, maintenance areas, and especially electrical distribution systems could also become part of the target matrix. Large-scale power infrastructure often reveals where the real industrial weight sits. Cut the energy supply and the damage cascades through production, command systems, and military sustainment. This is where the strategic logic broadens. The question is no longer only whether Dark Eagle would be fired, It is whether the weapon's presence alone is intended to reshape Iranian calculations before launch authority is ever given. For Washington, that creates leverage in the talks happening behind closed doors. For Tehran, it introduces a different kind of risk, not just the risk of damage, but the risk that key elements of deterrence become unusable at the very moment they are most needed. Meanwhile, the United States continues to reinforce the maritime squeeze with destroyers and intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets, such as the RQ-4 Global Hawk. That aircraft functions as a persistent eye in the sky, tracking movement around ports, shipping lanes, and strategic cargo patterns. In this kind of confrontation, information is not support tech. Information is strike preparation. The blockade therefore serves two purposes at once. Militarily, it disrupts movement. Politically, it sharpens the pressure at the bargaining table by controlling commercial lifelines and restricting the cash flow that sustains force posture. Yet one variable makes the whole situation harder to predict: the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps itself. This is an institution known for ideological rigidity and internal influence, and a willingness to present defiance even after taking real losses. That gap between political messaging and battlefield reality can be dangerous. An actor that insists it is winning while absorbing structural damage may not behave according to clean military logic. Decisions become tied to prestige, internal factional balance, and the need to preserve authority at home. In that environment, signaling can fail, misreading becomes easy. That is one reason the pairing of blockade pressure and a hypersonic threat is so significant. Diplomacy speaks to governments. Hard capability speaks to factions that only recalculate when the cost becomes immediate. If the negotiation channels do not deliver results, the probability of escalation rises. And in a renewed conflict, Dark Eagle would likely be used not only against missile facilities, but against strategic infrastructure with dual-use value. That phrase matters, dual use. These are civilian-linked systems that also support military mobility, production, or command. Rail nodes, power facilities, buried logistics centers, and distribution points can all serve both the public economy and the military machine. Striking such targets does more than interrupt operations for a day. It degrades the system that allows the Revolutionary Guard to move material, maintain tempo, and regenerate capability after a blow. So once that support web begins to fray, the visible military hardware starts to matter less. The same logic applies to Iranian drone production. Systems such as the Shahed family depend not just on assembly plants, but on electricity, component supply, and industrial continuity. A drone line can look intact on paper while being operationally crippled by upstream disruption. That raises the deeper strategic question. Would Dark Eagle be used simply to destroy assets, or as part of a pressure architecture designed to force concessions from hardline elements inside the Iranian power system? Perhaps even to trigger shifts in leadership influence. That possibility can no longer be dismissed if the conflict reignites. Iran's response is likely to be front-loaded and intense. Tehran has warned repeatedly that the blockade will fail and has pointed to energy infrastructure in Gulf states as a potential target set. In practical terms, that suggests an attempt to impose immediate costs across the region. Iran could decide to use a large share of its remaining ballistic missile inventory in an early saturation effort, trying to overwhelm defensive layers before they can stabilize. After that, a substantial reserve, potentially numbering in the hundreds, could be retained for sustained follow-on strikes. The objective would be clear: create an opening, then maintain pressure. In that scenario, missile defense becomes the hinge point. The issue is not only whether interceptors can hit incoming missiles, it is whether defensive systems can sustain the required volume over time without suffering their own kind of exhaustion. This is where the economics of war become merciless. If incoming weapons are numerous and comparatively cheap, While defensive missiles are expensive and finite, then the contest is not only tactical, it is industrial and financial. Now return to Dark Eagle. At the center of the current military conversation, it is being treated not as an isolated innovation, but as part of a longer American effort to restore fast, global precision strike capacity against time-sensitive targets. The system combines a ground-launched booster with a maneuverable hypersonic glide vehicle, and that configuration allows it to alter trajectory in flight, complicating interception and reducing predictability. Against static assumptions in air defense, unpredictability is often as valuable as speed. Its development has involved years of testing and contributions from major defense firms, including Lockheed Martin and Northrop Grumman. There were delays, there always are, with systems pushing the edge of performance. But the timing of its possible operational debut is what gives it strategic weight. The current confrontation with Iran has created the exact environment in which a weapon like this becomes attractive. Planners want a tool that is fast, precise, difficult to intercept, and credible against deeply buried or fleeting targets. Dark Eagle was built for that niche. Its defining distinction is not merely that it exceeds Mach 5, it is that it does so while preserving maneuverability, making its flight path harder to model and its arrival harder to prepare for. In practical terms, that means a defender sees less, understands less, and has less time. With a range exceeding 1,700 miles, the system can reach hardened facilities, buried command centers, nuclear-related installations, and mobile missile launch points that conventional strike packages may struggle to neutralize quickly. That gives it value both as a preemptive instrument and as a rapid response option. The cost is substantial, around $15 million per missile, but in the hierarchy of military spending, cost is judged against target value, response speed, and strategic effect. If the target is a ballistic missile unit capable of striking American bases or regional allies, planners will regard that price differently. Should hostilities intensify, Dark Eagle would likely be used as the spear point. The sequence would be designed for shock and dislocation. Hypersonic strikes against hardened nodes first, then stealth aircraft moving into the contested airspace. After that, F-35 fighters could be tasked with suppressing Iranian air defenses, exploiting low observability to degrade radars, and defensive networks. Once those layers are weakened, F-15E Strike Eagles could follow with additional strike packages, electronic warfare support, and escort functions. This is not a loose collection of platforms, it is a chained system. The operational objective would not be limited to destroying isolated targets. It would be to paralyze the defensive architecture as a whole, from air defense coverage and command networks to Revolutionary Guard infrastructure and hardened shelters. Look at the broader pattern and the imbalance becomes obvious. One side is building a long-range, precision, multi-domain attack framework tied to stealth, air power, and persistent surveillance. The other side still relies heavily on mobility, dispersion, quantity, and the hope that concealment can preserve launch capability long enough to matter. That does not mean Iran is defenseless. It means the old methods are being challenged by a system designed to erase reaction time. Once that happens, quantity alone may stop producing the same level of leverage. The wider American strategy resembles a layered game played on multiple boards at once. The blockade remains the primary lever, and military strike options are kept visible and ready. But they are nested inside a longer campaign to narrow Iran's alternatives and push it toward a less favorable bargain. The force posture in the region underlines that seriousness. Multiple major platforms have been moved into place not simply for deterrence theater, but to create real options, energy infrastructure, missile support, networks, and the institutional pillars that sustain Revolutionary Guard influence are all now part of the operational conversation. Iran, meanwhile, appears to be probing for openings in Europe. including attempts to widen differences among European states and draw Germany toward a softer line. But in the Gulf, the trend appears to be moving the other way. Regional states are showing less tolerance for instability that threatens energy flows and domestic security. That creates a fragmented diplomatic environment. Europe is not the Gulf is not Washington, and Iran is trying to play each arena differently, even as the military picture becomes less forgiving. Still, the heaviest pressure continues to fall on the Revolutionary Guard itself. Financial strain from lost exports combines with direct military risk, and that combination strikes at the institution's ability to fund operations, reward loyalty, and project influence. This is where economic warfare becomes political warfare. And the blockade is therefore the central development to watch. It is the mechanism through which the United States is trying to convert maritime control into strategic leverage, restrict trade, reduce cash, narrow options, and increase the cost of delay. If Dark Eagle is introduced into that equation, the pressure becomes multidimensional. One arm cuts revenue, and the other arm threatens or destroys the strategic assets that revenue was meant to sustain. That is what makes the current moment so unstable, not because war is inevitable, but because the tools now assembled give both sides incentives to act before the other side fully settles into position. Compression of time creates compression of judgment. The scale of the American deployment reflects that reality. 3 carrier strike groups are present in the broader theater, alongside more than 50,000 troops and a Marine Expeditionary Unit. Combined with a naval screen, their mission is not subtle. Maintain control at sea, stop blockade runners, and deny Tehran a path to rapid economic recovery. Behind that visible posture sits a second layer of conventional power. 3 carrier groups, nearly 200 combat and bomber aircraft, submarines, surveillance platforms, and ready strike packages form a force that can support, expand, or rapidly escalate the campaign, if ordered. Flexibility is the point. So Dark Eagle should not be viewed as a standalone answer. It is one component in a larger design built around sanctions, pressure, maritime interdiction, intelligence, dominance, stealth aviation, and long-range precision strike. And the sequence starts with economic constriction. If that fails, the military options become sharper. For now, the ceasefire still technically holds, but that stability looks provisional, not durable. Military force, economic coercion, and strategic signaling are all converging in the same space. And when that happens, even a small change can trigger a much larger chain reaction. That is the real story. Not the speeches, not the slogans. The real story is that the battlefield is being redesigned around speed, pressure, and the control of energy lifelines. If negotiations break down, the first moves may come fast, very fast. And if they do, the question will not be whether the region has entered a new phase, but how long the rest of the world can pretend that the Strait of Hormuz is only a regional problem